Good morning, greetings and welcome class. This is the fourth lecture presentation for the Philosophy of Religion course. Lecture presentation 3 and 4 deal with the problem of evil. The last lecture we dealt with theodicy, the various things that theodicy appeals to, and some of the implications if theodicy are not viable. In this lecture, we'll be going over the concept of anti-theodicy, and we'll also be looking at the contents and structure, as well as the implications of the Book of Job. Some of the reading, which I asked students to do before this course, is the first and second chapter of Zachary Braiterman's text, God After Auschwitz. And so this is the text, and I'll be looking at chapters 1 and 2 in particular, in reference to some of the passages in the Book of Job. I prepared a PowerPoint for this lecture, so I will go ahead and share this PowerPoint. Okay, so anti-theodicy and the Book of Job. What we're going to do first is define anti-theodicy, give a few examples of the types as well as the characteristics, and then we're going to look at the Book of Job, the structure, the contents, the wisdom in it in the context of the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible. And then we'll look at this question that Braiterman asks in his chapters on whether the Book of Job can be viewed as anti-theodicy. And this is particularly interesting because he gives options at the end depending on how some of the verses in the epilogue are translated. And so if it's translated in one way, it has definite theological or theodic applications and applications for theodicy. And if it's translated in a different way, it might be more anti-theodicy. And so we'll look at what this means and how this relates to the Book of Job. So the definition he gives of anti-theodicy is any religious response to the problem of evil whose proponents refuse to justify, explain, or accept as somehow meaningful the relationship between God and suffering. And so it acknowledges the existence of God, and it acknowledges the existence of suffering, but it doesn't necessarily want to create meaning out of the two or meaningfully associate the two. The example Braiterman gives is from the Palestinian Midrash, and this is an example of the commentary on the story of Cain and Abel. So the Midrash is a commentary on the Hebrew Bible scriptures. The story of Cain and Abel is found in chapter 4 of the book of Genesis. And in the story, Cain and Abel are brothers. They're both making sacrifices to God. God likes Abel's sacrifice, but does not like Cain. This provokes Cain to anger, and Cain murders Abel. This is the first murder in the narrative history of the Hebrew Bible. And God, being the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God, obviously observes and knows that Cain will kill Abel and does not prevent it. And so the anti-theodicy elements is acknowledging all of this, but not necessarily drawing a conclusion, right? And so I'll go ahead and read that. It says, "It is difficult to say this thing, and the mouth cannot utter it plainly. Think of two athletes wrestling before the king. Had the king wished, he could have separated them, but he did not so desire, and one overcame the other and killed him. He, the victim, crying out before he died, 'Let my cause be pleaded before the king.'" And so just like Cain and Abel were fighting and Cain ended up killing Abel before God, this is an analogous situation in which if the king wanted to stop the two athletes from fighting, the king could have prevented the death of one. And it's similarly suggesting that God could have prevented this evil, this first murder, but for some reason did not. And so this element of anti-theodicy just expresses confusion over why this is. So again, it's just a expression of that evil happened, that evil could have been prevented, and confusion over why it was not. But it does not seek to justify, which a theodicy would. There's three basic elements for anti-theodicy. One is complaint, right? And so if evil occurs, a anti-theodicy could involve complaining that the evil occurred, right? Next would involve a solidarity. And so those with the solidarity of those experiencing the evil. So relating to and siding with and being a part of those who experience the evil. Again, no justification. And the third is an incomprehension as to why the evil is occurring. So it could express one, two, or three of these elements. And these are some of the basic features for anti-theodicy. The former one, which we just read, this definitely experienced some of the confusion over what has happened. And so we could also perhaps think of Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov's famous criticism of children suffering as an anti-theodicy. So he's talking to his brother Alexei, who is a monk, and so he is sort of standing in for this belief in the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God. And there's this idea, and there is real evil. He's going into detail about children suffering, and he's sort of contrasting it with this idea that maybe there's this ultimate plan or purpose for all of this negativity. And Ivan Karamazov rejects this idea. And toward the end of the Rebellion chapter, which we'll also listen to or read, he says this: "From love of humanity, I don't want it. I would rather be left with unavenged suffering. I would rather remain with my unavenged suffering and unsatisfied indignation, even if I were wrong. Besides, too high a price is asked for harmony. It is beyond our means to pay so much to enter on it. And so I hasten to give back my entrance ticket. And if I am an honest man, I am bound to give it back as soon as possible." And so what he's saying is if God has some divine plan that involves all of this, what we might call needless suffering, whatever that plan is, whatever that justification is, whatever that transformation of creation is not worth it. If this was like a performance, he's going to give back his ticket and say, I don't want to be a part of it. And so this is also sort of expressing some of the confusion, some of the solidarity, but it's also making a decision of not wanting to participate in whatever this idea might be. This could be another example. And so the remainder of this presentation will be investigating whether the book of Job can be seen as having elements of theodicy or elements of anti-theodicy. And it's interesting because I think arguments can be made both ways. And in that sense, it's I think, a great learning exercise and to try to grasp elements of theodicy and elements of anti-theodicy. So the first thing to bring up when looking at the book of Job is the structure of the Hebrew Bible. Job is a book found in the Hebrew Bible. So let's sort of look at the contents of the Hebrew Bible and its structure. So it's divided into three aspects. We have the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books. Then we have the prophets. The first 4 prophets are described as the former prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and King. And the last 4 are described as the latter prophets. We have Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and the book of the 12, or the 12 minor prophets. Then the third part is described as the writings, in which we have Psalms, Proverbs, and then we come to Job. And so in the writings, there's a group of writings called the wisdom literature, in which Job is understood to be in. One thing to note, first I want to note Deuteronomy as well as the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and King. 2 words are often used, Deuteronomy and Deuteronomistic, for a particular type of understanding of positive and negative events. So again, Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Pentateuch. It describes that time period in which Moses and Israel, after the Exodus, have been brought to Sinai, and this is when they received the law. And toward Joshua leading them toward the promised land and Moses staying back, right? But then there's also this term called Deuteronomistic history. And this is the history told from basically the receiving of the law all up until the way of the last king of Israel. And so the Deuteronomistic history includes the book of Deuteronomy, as well as the book of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And so it includes the book of Deuteronomy and the former prophets. And the way that history is described, that narrative history, we might even say this philosophy behind the history, is it describes a series of events, some positive, some negative, but the reason given for either the event being positive or negative has to do with the obedience and the righteousness of the behavior of either Israel as a group or certain people. And this is a fascinating thing. If you're familiar with the Hebrew Bible and with these books, try to recall some stories in which good things happened or bad things happened. Let's take a war, for example. We take a war between the kingdom of Israel under the command of Saul and a neighboring people they are warring against, right? And whether they win or lose will depend on how righteous they are, how obedient they are. During military victories, it's never really described that the reason there was a loss is because they didn't plan well enough, the other group of people had a tactical advantage. It's never explained like this. It's either someone disobeyed, for example, Saul, when he used a medium to conjure the spirit of Samuel, he died in battle later. It wasn't necessarily explained because the strategy wasn't bad, the strategy was bad, it was because he did that thing. And so often this is how things are described. If good outcomes happen, it's because of righteous behavior. If bad outcomes happen, it's because of wicked behavior. And so this type of philosophy, this type of understanding of the world is presented in this Deuteronomistic history. And this is something that implicitly the book of Job will challenge, will sort of put into conversation. Another way of looking at this structure is we have the Pentateuch, we have the prophets, and we have the writings. The contents is the same as the Old Testament, which is what the Christian religion refers to the Hebrew Bible as. But the structure is slightly different. In the Old Testament, we have the Pentateuch, then we have the writings, and then we have the latter prophets pointing toward the New Testament. Here we have the Pentateuch, we have the prophets, and we have the writings reflecting on the contents of both, trying to, in a sense, provide wisdom given these different presentations of experience. And so in the writings, we have different groups, and the group we want to focus on is the wisdom literature, in which we have Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And so we'll be looking at Job as wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible, particularly wisdom literature as it relates to the problem of evil. Here is the macro structure of the book of Job, or the organization, the outline. And here, using this slide, I'll basically explain in summary the book of Job. First, we have the first two chapters, the prologue, and then we have the dialogues. We notice that the majority of the book of Job is the dialogue. It's the dialogue between Job, his three friends, and a fourth individual named Elihu. And then later, there's this dialogue between, if we see the discourse of Elihu and the discourse of the Lord. And so, but the most of the book are these dialogues, and I'll go into that in detail. Then Elihu will speak, then the Lord will come down and speak, and then we have finally the epilogue, right? And so here's what happens, right? In the prologue, we have God and the adversary, or Satan, but the word just means the adversary or accuser. And this individual, Satan, and God are talking about Job. God is boasting about Job, explaining that Job is very righteous, Job does everything right, Job praises God. And Satan brings up this idea that the only reason that Job is faithful to God and praising God and likes God is because God blesses Job, and God keeps Job comfortable, and God takes care of Job. And Satan sort of has this hypothetical. He said, if you were to allow negative things to happen to Job, Job would curse you. And God says, no, Job would not curse me. And so they kind of make a bet. And Satan says, if you allow me to have very negative things, evil things happen to Job, I bet that Job will curse you. And so we have 2 rounds of negative, evil things happening to Job. God says, okay, and essentially allows Satan to do terrible things in a series of events. All Job's property is destroyed by natural disasters or thieves. Job loses his property. His home falls down and kills all of his children. And so he loses his property and his family. But he still does not curse God. And then Satan says, well, let me just harm his body. I won't kill him, but let me harm his body, and then he will curse you. And so God says, okay, do that. And so Satan causes huge boils to break out all over Job's skin. Job shatters a pot and takes the pottery sharps and scrapes off the boils because they're painful. And he's sort of just sitting there in dust and ashes in severe pain. His wife approaches him and explains, curse God and dies, and then leaves. And Job is just sitting there. He does not curse God, but he is very confused about what is going on because he knows he hasn't done anything wrong. And he's also in a lot of pain and agony from not only losing everything, but also the physical pain. And this is where the dialogue begins. So the prologue is basically for us, the reader. We are told what happens and why it happened, right? Job is left in this state of confusion and chaos and pain and has no idea what's going on. But we, the reader, know that the reason this happened is because of this bet between God and Satan, right? And so the dialogue occurs next when Job's 3 friends hear of the trouble. They go to see him, to comfort him. They sit by him, and they are just all in silence and in terrible, terrible grief because of all this negative things that happened to the friends. Job, after a long silence, that everyone's silent, all 4 of them, Job begins to speak. But let me introduce you to the cast of characters first. So we have Job, and Job is a righteous man. We have the Lord, who, according to the Theodicy, is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. And so we might ask, well, why would God allow this to happen? Right? We had Satan, or the adversary. We have Job's wife. We have Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. We have Elihu, and we have these terrible monsters at the end, Leviathan and Behemoth, right? And so this first cycle of dialogues goes on, and Job breaks the silence, and he just starts to complain and sort of vent his feelings on everything that goes on. I'll share one of those. He says, perish the day on which I was born, and the night in which it was announced, a male has been conceived. May that day be darkened. May light not shine on it. May what blackens the day terrify it. May obscurity carry off that night. May it not be counted among the days of the years. And as he goes on, he even asks later that he wishes he was born dead. So this is the complaint. And this is one of the anti-theodic theodicy elements, which is just the complaining over this terrible evil. Complaining often sounds as a negative word, but this doesn't necessarily mean negative. It's just he is very distraught, and he is letting those feelings be known. He's sharing his feelings to his friend, and he is complaining on what happened. So this is the first thing. The next thing that occurs is his friends respond, and basically, because we might argue, have this Deuteronomistic understanding of the world, where if you do good, you are punished. If you do good, you're rewarded. If you do evil, you're punished. And therefore, some implicit premises sort of come out of this. If you're punished, you must have done evil, could be a way of looking at it. And if you're blessed, you must have done good. And this, unfortunately, is the way Job's friends see the world. And so when they see all this evil happen to him, they automatically assume he must have done something wrong for this evil to be happening. And the alternative would mean something like, oh, God is not just because God doesn't punish the righteous and reward the wicked. That would be absurd to this understanding, right? And so when they hear Job complain, they don't like it because this suggests that something's wrong with the way the universe is, as opposed to something is wrong with the way Job sees it. And so Job complains, like in the verse I just read, and then his friends, one at a time, for much of the book, just saying, well, obviously, you're in the wrong, Job. You must have done something wrong. Confess it to us, confess it before God, make the proper atonement so that the evil cannot stop happening. Eliphaz says something like this, and then Job objects to it, and this is Job's objection. Now be so good as to face me. I will not lie to your face. Relent. There will not be injustice. Relent. I am still in the right. Is injustice on my tongue? Can my palate not discern evil? So Job is saying, I would know if I did something evil. I did not do anything evil. And so again, he is sort of addressing this fact that he did not do anything wrong enough to be punished like this. And so his friend's view of the world, he's saying, is incorrect. And much of these verses, if we go back, basically verse 3 to 31 is this exchange. One friend will accuse him of doing something wrong. He says he didn't. Second friend will accuse him of doing something wrong. He says he didn't. And this just goes for, well, it goes for 28 chapters. So I'll give you some more samples of this. Bildad, how long will you speak such things? Your utterances are a mighty wind. Will God pervert the right? Will the Almighty pervert justice? So basically, again, they're saying, look, either what you're saying makes either you wrong or God wrong, and God cannot be wrong, so you must be wrong. This has to be justice, according to their worldview. Job responds, and he uses the metaphor of a court, right? If a trial of strength, he is, meaning God, is the strong one. If a trial in court, who will summon him for me, right? So how can you really get God to be on trial? Though I were innocent, my mouth would condemn me. Though I were blameless, he would prove me crooked. And so it is kind of pointless to argue with God if God is all powerful, all knowing, and perfectly good. But at the same time, Job continues to say, he has done nothing wrong. And he continues, why would you let me come out of the womb? Better I had expired before any eye saw me. Had I been as though I never was, had I been carried from the womb to the grave. And again, this is more of the anti-theodic elements, in the sense that he's saying, given what I just experienced, it may have been better that I was not born, right? And okay, we'll get to the problematic passage later. Let me return to the macro structure. So this conversation again goes on for all of till chapter 31. And then Elihu, who's a generation younger, proposes this idea. He says, well, perhaps God is still God, God is still righteous, God is still just, and yet Job didn't do anything wrong. Can we hold these two ideas in our mind, that Job didn't do anything wrong and God is still just? And everyone kind of ponders and reflects on this. Then God comes down and rebukes the three friends for accusing Job of doing something wrong. He says, this is not correct. Then God takes Job up into a whirlwind, so to speak, and shows him basically all of creation. Like if he could have this panoramic view of both time and space, he shows him these monsters called Leviathan and Behemoth. And he said, well, these are just like little creatures compared to me. And God makes it clear that Job is a human being and God is this very powerful, all-powerful creature. God, and then God sets Job back down out of this whirlwind, right? And so Job is just there, kind of stupefied from this experience of just how powerful God is, and in comparison, how small and weak he is. And so in this remaining remaining discourse, this last verse, Braiterman draws attention to this thing that Job says. And this, again, it makes it quite fascinating when we think about theodicy or anti-theodicy. He says, identifying the book of Job as theodic or anti-theodic significance hinges on the proper interpretation of what may or may not be the retraction of Job's protest in chapter 42, verse 6. According to the Jewish Publication Society translation, Job repents. Following God's theophany, which was that huge presentation that he showed Job, Job concludes, and this is what Job says: "Wherefore I abhor my words and repent, seeing I am dust and ashes," right? And so after experiencing this glorification of God, Job just says, I repent that I said anything negative, that I said all those complaining ideas, that I was complaining at all. Now, Job never cursed God, but he cursed his own life, right? He did succeed in never cursing God. In that case, God won the bet against Satan. But Job did act in such a way that he was very distraught and cursed many things, such as his life, right? But then if we interpret this verse or we translate this verse in this way, it suggests that Job repents, that he did that. And so that has more of a theodic tone to it, meaning that perhaps God is still good, God is still righteous. After seeing whatever he saw, he realized the glory, the goodness of God, and he repents for ever doubting, right? So that might be one way, and that's very theodic in nature. But he says, according to Edwin Good, this verse constitutes nothing less than the punchline of the entire book, meaning everything we read before hinges on exactly what this means, right? If Job repents, the book ends on a strong theodic note that most critics have heretofore observed. But if Job never retracts his complaint, the protest stands and the book remains consistently anti-theodic to the end, right? And so what type of translation would look like Job did not repent, right? And so Braiterman is still talking. He says, I can think of no other case in which the interpretation, in which the interpretation of the entire text hangs on such a punchline. On the precise interpretation of two words, does the Hebrew word as means retract, as means retract or despise. Does Job despise of what he has recanted? The word nihamti is also unclear. Does it mean that Job repents, or does nihamti reflect a turn of mind? And if the former, how does he repent? With contrition, reluctantly? What does he repent? Does Job despise his own complaint, or has he come to hate dust and ashes? A brief look at the number of possible translations shows that the meaning of the verse proves notoriously unclear. And so Braiterman provides us with 4 different translations of this verse, and some have that theodic tone and some have the anti-theodic tone. Now, which one is more correct? I will confess I do not know. I only took 6 months of Hebrew in my own studies. But let me read all 4, but this will serve to sort of tease out the theodic interpretation versus the anti-theodic interpretation. So first one by JPS. Wherefore I abhor my words and repent, seeing I am dust and ashes. The 1985 edition. Therefore I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes. And these 2 definitely have theodic tones, right? He is sorry for what he did. By his complaining, he repents over it, and he says, look, I am just dust and ashes, whereas God is God, and had I seen what I saw before, I would not have done that, so I repent for doing that. Therefore I retract and repent of dust and ashes. That might be he repents as he is there, as he is, dust and ashes. Therefore I despise and repent of dust and ashes. And this could be that last idea of him despising that he is so small and so immaterial compared to God. And so just like in that complaint about how would you bring God to court, or how would you be more powerful than God if you feel you're right, this is what he despises. And basically, he says something perhaps similar to this idea of giving back one's ticket for this play of creation, but he despises. You can't really do that, right? You might be tired of this creative play, but you can't actually leave. You can't actually check out or give back your ticket, because God is so powerful and we individuals are so powerless given the contrast. According to the 1978 translation, Job repents in dust and ashes. He now abhors his former complaint and piously retracts. Hebel's Job behaves quite differently. According to Hebel, the Jewish word nehamti, repent, reflects a change of mind. First, Job retracts, that is, he forsakes litigation. However, he repents of dust and ashes. That is, Job picks himself up, forsakes lamentation, forswears remorse, and returns to normal life. Good takes Hebel's Job one step further. He notes that no direct object immediately follows the word abhor in the Hebrew text. That is, Job does not abhor or retract his complaint. According to Good, the verb despise and repent shares a single direct object, dust and ashes. Good has Job actively coming to despise the religion rituals of mortification and self-abnegation. So we have very different understandings here. The former theodic, the latter anti-theodic. And this was the point in looking at the book of Job, right? So I hope you've enjoyed this interpretations of the translations and how those interpretations can reflect theodic elements, which is a justification. And this justification would be Job's seeing the glory of God, or the antitheodic, which means Job acknowledges the evil. Obviously, he acknowledged that God exists and God is very powerful, but he's not going to try to justify it. If anything, he's going to complain that of having to participate in it. And this is the distinction here. Whichever one it is, that's a fascinating question. Lastly, some further reflections on Job. If we think about Job as character versus us as reader, the knowledge Job has concerning the evil that happened to him, that occurred to him. Now, in the epilogue, we're told that Job gets blessed again. He gets new children. He's back to how he was, a little bit better even, right? Job does not know why that evil happened to him. We, the reader, do know, but Job does not. And perhaps that is sort of the anti-theodic aspect of the text as well. Job does not know that the evil happened to him. And even if hypothetically Job were to read the book of Job, again, this is more of a philosophical idea. Obviously, this would be kind of absurd in practical terms. But if we imagine somehow Job learned why the evil happened to him, I imagine that this would be such a how shall we say it? I don't think he would have ever imagined that necessarily. And this might indicate that although we, the reader, know why the evil happened to Job, if we were in the situation of Job, we might not understand why evil occurs to us. Or when we look out into the world, if we don't necessarily take our own personal situations, hopefully no one ever encounters evil like this, why such evil is happening in the world. Should we try to explain it, or is this just beyond explanation? This would be most of the theodic versus anti-theodic elements. Is anti-theodic the same way of saying this mystery too? This is interesting, but I think many would argue that that saying it's a mystery would be more theodic in nature, unless one's intent is one of those three things: the complaint, the solidarity, or the incomprehension. And so you can see very quickly, and Braiterman also makes this point, that these terms are fluid throughout the text, right? If you're expressing this incomprehensibility in the evil, that could have connotations of mystery, but could also have connotations of just acknowledging that. So this is fascinating, I find, with regard to how we approach the problem of evil philosophically. using the resources of the wisdom literature, particularly in this case, the Hebrew Bible. I hope this presentation was helpful. I hope you are now familiar with the contents of the book of Job. Do also read or listen to the book of Job. And most importantly, I hope you are familiar with the distinction between theodicy and the various forms it takes, and the concept of anti-theodicy and the various characteristics it has. So take care. I hope this was helpful. And thank you very much.